Okay, so Chimigwach everyone for your patience while we get started here. So now, without further ado, we will hear from the action team chairs to present the work of their action teams. In case you're not too familiar with our project, in summary, very briefly, the action teams were created for each of the priority SDGs that we identified at the 2019 SDG Community Forum, and they are no poverty, quality education, clean water and sanitation, and climate action. The fifth local priority, Indigenous leadership, has been embedded into the work of each team. We are so grateful to the action team chairs, co-chairs, and community participants who have dedicated so much time and expertise to our local understanding of these goals through a lens of leaving no one behind, whom this could not have been possible without. We will first hear from SDG 1, the No Poverty Action Team, by Joelle Fabre. I will now screen share your presentation and we'll pass the feather to you, Joelle. Chimigwach.
Honey, everyone. It's really hard to start talking after such powerful words and beautiful prayers. So I just wanted to thank all of you this morning. So my name is Joelle Fabre, and I'm a settler in Nogojiwanong. I'm originally from Vendée. That's where the accent you hear comes from. It's a rural region in Western France. I am so grateful to be living, learning, working in such a beautiful land surrounded by water. Running water really makes my heart sing, except if it's in my basement, but that's a different story. I won't go there. I'm really grateful to be here with you all. I've learned already so much from all my colleagues on this project and all the people who've been part of the No Poverty Action Team. So before I actually introduce these members, I need to talk to you a little bit about the goal of the No Poverty Action Team. It was mentioned yesterday that initially the 2019 forum had identified basic income as the main goal for the No Poverty team. And when I was asked by Julie to chair this team, I reached out to the Basic Income Peterborough Network, which is a group that has been very active since 2015 in promoting and raising awareness about basic income locally. So I talked about the possibility of the network to merge with this team. And after some conversation, we felt that actually maybe it would make sense to change a bit the focus for the action team, given the fact that currently we don't have a strong anti-poverty network in our community. And so we decided, and in collaboration with the organizing committee, to really focus on the other component of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is to make sure that no one is left behind. So that's really what the focus of the action team became. Next slide, please. So I want you to meet virtually, at least in names, all the participants of the team. So Javier Bravo is from the New Canadian Centre, a local entrepreneur who is really focused on social enterprises in particular. Jane Garrett, the Aspire program coordinator at the John Howard Society. We've had Dolores Lalonde, the Nichkimunada Anichinaabe Kriwag Services Circle executive director. Sue Lily Dixon, an artist and accessibility advocate locally. Jason King, an accessibility expert as well locally. Sabrina Keepers, Women and HIV/AIDS coordinator at PARN. Anushka Muralitharan from Trent, Oxfam. And Nicole Van Stone from Nitkunada Anishinaabe WAG Services Circle and local real estate agent. We had a few more people, but they were not able to participate. Please, the next slide. So I don't know if you've been following the forum, you will have been noticing that there's been a strong importance given to the theme of language. Last night, for instance, we heard about the stories carried by names and how important it is to know those stories in that language. Language is for me a powerful entry point into imagination that helps me breathe better and dream the kind of world I want to live in. And so that's why I decided I would start this presentation with a short excerpt from a poem. And it's actually a poem from a local artist who I believe is with us virtually today. It's Ziza. And Ziza, I want to express my gratitude to you for your beautiful gifts of language and for this new book of poetry that you published last year. Its title is Consents Plus Equals Minus Severances. Poetry, just like water, can take my breath away. And I've been deeply moved by the poems in this collection. The excerpt, I really can't speak English this morning. The excerpt that is here on the slide today comes from a longer poem called Stop the Cuts. And so I'll read it for you. If we have been taught to trust our guts, we wouldn't be saying, stop the cuts. We'd be chanting, let's grow a better world together, proclaiming radical transformation is now or never. I feel that words are really important in helping us frame our vision. Next slide, please. If you look at the title of its SDG goal, and if you look at the other 16 SDGs, you'll see that this one is the only one that starts very negatively with the word no. And in that way, I feel like it's less engaging. For instance, you're going to hear next about the SDG, quality education. When we hear about quality education, we respond differently than when we hear no poverty. And on top of that, this title for the SDG is actually misleading. Next slide, please. So if you look at the aim for the SDG internationally, it states to end poverty in all forms and dimensions by 2030. When you dig deeper into this goal, you see that actually it's to end extreme poverty, which according to the UN is based on the having $1.25 American dollar per day. And so that's the extreme poverty that the goal wants to eradicate. When you look at what's happening in Canada, the goal here is actually to reduce the rate of poverty by 50% below the 2015 baseline by 2030. In 2018, Canada decided to embrace a new measure of poverty, which is called the market basket measure. and it's determined by the regional cost of a specific basket of goods and services, such as housing, food, clothing, and other necessary expenses. Interestingly enough, in 2018, when this measure was adopted, many anti-poverty advocates asked the question whether digital access was going to be integrated in this basket measure. And little did we know how relevant this question was going to be, for instance, in 2020. But next slide, please. What you see really is that this SDG shouldn't be no poverty. It's really only less poverty. Now, our no poverty action team actually didn't go for that less poverty. We really started to have conversations with the idea of eradicating. Now, I need to be clear with everyone that we've had 2 meetings. We are planning debriefing meeting in early March. And so well, I'm going to share with you what those conversations were. I want to be clear that, it's very little time to do extensive work around an issue like poverty. But I think you're going to see that some of the conversations that we've had offer a bit of a path on how to move forward. Next slide, please. So what we started to do first was looking at who is being left behind when we talk about poverty. And as you can see from this slide, we started to identify many groups of people who are left behind, racialized and indigenous community members, single parents, people living on low income, people with disabilities, folks involved with the justice system. The list was fairly large. Next slide, please. And so then we started to talk about what will our community look like when we eradicate poverty. That started us thinking in different directions. But then, as was mentioned yesterday by Elder Phyllis Williams, the Indigenous Leadership Action Team gave us a definition of poverty, which really, as we introduced that definition in our conversation, really enabled us to have a much richer conversation. So I'm going to read to you that definition because it's in small letters on this slide, and I think it might be good for all of us to rehear it. The definition of poverty to Indigenous peoples is different from Western concept. Poverty in the Western sense can be rich in an Indigenous perspective with community and family. For Indigenous peoples, no poverty will mean the community is looking after each other and ensuring everyone has access to what they need to thrive. So, as I said, this definition really helped us to broaden our thinking and our vision. Our conversation grew richer. And as you can see from the slide, lots of stickies, lots of ideas emerged. So we started to emphasize the idea of thriving, the idea of dignity, equity, a greater sense of community, less focus on profit, and more importance given to relationships. Next slide, please. So when looking at all the ideas that were generated, it became clear that what we wanted to do was to see a focus on system change. We felt that only by focusing on system change, we would be able to really address structural inequities. And with this goal in mind, we identified some really key practices that we felt were essential to meet that goal. These are those key practices: nothing about us without us, listening deeply to people's stories, the importance of bringing spiritual engagement to the conversation and to the work, promoting experiential learning, practicing harm reduction, embracing social enterprises and small businesses for greater impact. And we also focused on youth. We feel that it is absolutely essential for this work to be meaningful. Next slide, please. Now, you may have noticed that I've talked about poverty for a little while now, and I did not actually mention yet the context in which we find ourselves. It was interesting that in February 2020, the federal government issued some new data about poverty, the official poverty rate in Canada. And as you can see from this slide, what we've seen is a continuous decrease of the number of people living in poverty. Unfortunately, I think that the next time we're going to get some data, we're going to see the movement going radically upward. From the work that I do on the ground in the area of food insecurity, what I see right now locally is more poverty, not less poverty. And so that's why I want to make a call for action. And it's a call for action that really grew out of the work that we. Next slide, please. We really need action on the ground if we want to reach no poverty by 2030. But I'm not talking about any action. I'm talking about bold actions, grounded in a real commitment to leaving no one behind, and also grounded in the learning that we gained from the Indigenous leadership action team. This work needs to be centered around relationships, and it needs to embrace a community approach. Now, I can't stress enough the importance of those bold actions. And that's why I wanted to end my presentation by going back to Ziza's poem. I think that words can spark action. And my words wouldn't, but I think Ziza's words can. We wouldn't be begging, we'd be insisting. Keep Earth at the center. Value always of thinking. Relationships are key, and make them reciprocal. We'd be saying, let's do better. Pledging, we will do better. Miigwech.
That was so powerful, Joelle. Miigwech for sharing those words, and miigwech Ziza for writing them. That gave me goosebumps. And miigwech to the No Poverty Action Team for all of the work that you've done for us, for the communities. So I would now like to invite the Quality Education Action Team co-chairs, Liz Stone and Faith M. My apologies, I don't want to missay your name. So I will now start sharing my screen and pass you the floor.
Miigwech. Dr. Joelle. That was very moving and very powerful. Miigwech. Bonjour. I'm waiting for our presentation. Nimen Rijiken Pwe Dijinakos Rijiken Dorem. The best clan ever. Amjanong, Minwa, Badasige, Dunjaba, Nogojiwanong, Megwa, Doda. And it's my honor to be working with the Quality Education SDG number 4 and with Faith, and to talk about a little bit of the work that we were doing. And I echo the thoughts of Joelle, and I'm sure the other groups, the other SDG action groups, that working with the teams were just amazing. And if we could have had hours and hours and hours of time, I'm sure we would have just got more of the rich sharing and the rich contribution to the conversation. So what we're presenting here today is really truly the work of that committee and the work of the community here in Nogojiwanong. So if you can go to the next slide. So what we have here is going to be extremely hard to read, and it's kind of purposeful in a way, because we started out our work as identifying what's happening here in the community. And there's a lot happening here in Nogojiwanong. And so we worked on challenging ourselves and worked on challenging a little bit. And for myself, being a part of this committee, it was, and co-chairing this committee was really challenging my understanding and the terminology of education and quality and what that is. I came to Western academics very late in my life, and that understanding and grappling with that and challenging not only myself but the institutions in which I work to what is education, what is curriculum, what is delivery and pedagogy and epistemology and all of those big words, ology words, and really kind of turning around and having those discussions about within myself and within the group to acknowledge that Anishinaabe education and learning and pulling all of those things together. So we focused a lot on what is education? Is it really linear with an end goal, with a big picture on the wall of us in our convocation gear? Is it about the degrees and the diplomas and the certificates that we get? Is it about the curriculum we build, or is it relational? So is it cyclical, the way we live our lives? I could have gone back and talked about where I grew up in my territories, Amjanong, Sarnia, and the challenges that we have in that territory as far as environment and sustainability and health and poverty and all of those things, or Bidasigi, which on the surface is so beautiful and clean, and then until you dive deeper. So what we did in our group and what I continue to do and had the blessing to work with Faith is to challenge ourselves, and that's how we kind of presented our work. So miigwech for having us and listening to our presentation. If you can go to the next slide. So the first thing that we wanted to outline is what those indicators were, and explain a little bit, not just how we've described them, but how Canada has described what those indicators are, and dive a little bit deeper when we moved into the work and to localize them a bit, which Faith will talk about. So as far as Canada goes, or the northern part of Turtle Island goes, Canada identified SDGs 4 as Canadians, or people that live in the northern part of Turtle Island, is having inclusive and quality education throughout their entire lives. So really looking back at how Ogama Witang talked about when she looks out the window and she sees those children. For myself, it was acknowledging that, and I've used this example a lot in the last few months, is those stones that I have in my purse that children have given me and that I hang on to all the times, and how they're teaching as well as we're teaching. The indicators for this quality education is the proportion of adults who have had high school diploma or equivalent by specific age groups. post-secondary completion rates, 25 to 64 years old by type of diploma. So when we looked at these things in this group, we actually dove way deeper than this. The committee members, whether they realized it or not, or named it, I should say, or not, said this isn't good enough for this territory. This isn't good enough for the work that we do. And we have to start a lot earlier and do things a lot differently. So just giving you the groundwork of where we started. Faith, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Liz. It has been a pleasure co-chairing with you. And Shaylin, I know that panic that comes when we see consonants placed in places we're not used to in the English language. But my last name is pronounced Mwesije, and it's a name from Western Uganda. And I'm a graduate of the MAS, the Sustainability Studies program, and a longtime KWIC volunteer, first-time co-chair. So let's go to that next slide. So as we've been hearing, as we've been learning over the past couple of sessions, leaving no one behind is a central principle that drives the Sustainable Development Goals and this project in particular. And it's about bringing together a wide range of people and groups, including those who have historically been excluded from development conversations. Next slide. So our Quality Education Action Team had some great discussions about the principle of leaving no one behind and centering Indigenous knowledge and leadership when it comes to quality education. And here are some ideas and recommendations that the action team talked about as a way to lay that groundwork for these conversations to continue after this forum. So we talked about identifying whose voices were missing from the 2019 discussions around quality education, because as we know, the two priorities that emerged out of that forum were a focus on place-based and experiential learning as a form of quality education. So we just wanted to make sure with more voices added to the discussion that we're actually capturing, the entire community's priorities. So this led us to create and implement a short survey that Liz will talk about shortly. And we talked about how to improve access to and the quality of education for Indigenous peoples within the region, especially in terms of opportunities for place-based language and experiential education. And we discussed going beyond quantitative targets and indicators to assess the quality of education available to all people and at all levels. And I talk about that a bit more when I go into localizing the targets. Lastly, we talked about how to provide greater support, financial and otherwise, for Indigenous-led and experiential educational opportunities. Next slide, please. I'll let Liz speak on the survey.
So one of the things that we talked about right from the start was really dedicating and being accountable to that leave no one behind, and how we were going to get more voices at the table and get more information at the table. And so we decided that we were going to develop a survey and ask those guiding questions across the area and the territory based on our connection. So right away we acknowledged our interconnection and that growing and coming together again and what our responsibilities were. So the survey was created, a very short survey. I think there was 4 or 5 questions, but we wanted that input and we sent it out via the members of the committee. And we got 32 responses, and it was from local educators, from community organizers, adult learners, parents of learners under 18 years old. And what place-based means is basically on the land. So if we're talking about, say, Curve Lake, then it's things that are happening in Curve Lake or on the land in Curve Lake. So place-based or experiential. So in the responses that we got back from the survey, 88% of the respondents strongly agree that experiential education is important for quality education in their community. And as educators, our group acknowledged that everyone learns differently. And I know that I'm kind of preaching to the choir about that. We all know some of us are very visual, some of us are very task oriented, some of us are very vocal, and some of us don't quite get it until we're right there learning how to knock that tap into the tree. 78% of our respondents strongly agree that place-based education is important for quality education in their community. So making sure that you're there in the area, and we've also identified the specific challenges that COVID or anything else in the future would bring, and agreed that those weren't necessarily good enough excuses, that we had to push, that we had to figure out how we could still do these things. And the other thing that came along, I think is important to identify, is although we pushed ourselves to really take into consideration that leave no one behind in the creation of this survey with the best intent, is we still feel that it wasn't enough, that we didn't reach everybody. And whether that was time limited or capacity or resource limited, and not being able to go out and really talk to or meet with those marginalized groups was something that we would encourage to happen further. Next slide.
Awesome, thank you, Liz. So the SDG 4 action team took a closer look at the UN framework and the targets of that goal, and began the process of localizing these targets to better suit our community's needs and priorities. So this was one of my favorite exercises that we got to do as a team at our second meeting. And continuing on that theme of the importance of language, we began that process of making the SDG 4 targets more inclusive and equitable, putting them in words and language that we felt better represented our local community's goals for quality education, and filtering them through that lens of leaving no one behind and centering Indigenous knowledge. So because of time constraints, we didn't get to localize all the targets. There's about 10 targets in total for this goal, but we addressed about half of them. And the goal of the exercise was to solicit the team's initial thoughts and suggestions and try out this method of collaborative, reflective localizing. So that future work on this can have this as a starting point. So here are some examples to give you an idea of where we sort of landed after this exercise. So at target 4.2, that says by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education so that they're ready for primary education. We tweaked that to say, by 2030, ensure that all children have access to quality and diverse forms of early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education so that they foster a sense of wonder and fondness for learning, in addition to being prepared for primary education. So as we noticed that a lot of the UN language isn't very gender diverse, a lot of boy-girl binaries. So to make it more inclusive, we replaced those with all children or all people. And we also wanted to add fostering a sense of wonder and fondness of learning as a key part of accessing quality childhood development and pre-primary education, as a way of going beyond those quantitative, linear type goals, and get away from that linear checklist way of thinking about quality education targets. Next slide, please. This one's a bit long, so I won't read all of it, but target 4.7, the original version, by 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. We tweaked that to add the word regenerative. So a lot of, we had a lengthy discussion about this, especially around the words sustainable and sustainable development. And I think we landed on using the word regenerative. We also added that all learners should develop the knowledge and skills needed to promote truth and reconciliation, as well as local and digital citizenship. And the digital part especially came up as we're experiencing COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that it's having on learning and going into this remote learning space and the needs that come with that. So that's kind of how we tweaked target 4.7. And lastly, target 4.A, by 2030, build and upgrade education facilities that are child, disability, and gender sensitive and provide safe, nonviolent, inclusive, and effective learning environments for all. So that's the original way that the UN framed it. And our tweaked version says by 2030, provide learning spaces, including outdoor land-based learning spaces that honor diverse needs and provide safe, welcoming, inclusive, joyful, and effective learning environments for all. So again, just diversifying that language, we replaced the education facilities with learning spaces as we felt that that was a more inclusive word as we think about how outdoor and land-based learning spaces are a great source of quality education. And it doesn't always need to be an indoor space to get that experience. So just added language such as welcoming and joyful, as that is what we envision for our learning environments. But again, still room for lots of discussion and localizing of these targets. This isn't completed work by any means. The action team was just beginning that process, and hopefully this work can be carried on.
So once we started diving really deep into things, and it was coming to the end of our meetings, and trying to pull this information together that the committee provided. And what we started talking about, and for myself, I'll share that I'm very task oriented. I like a start and a finish line to the projects that I work on. So for me, there was a bit of a struggle. And most of the educators, most of the people in our group were the same way. It's like, okay, here's the goals, here's the finish, we did it. So we had to really think about that. And when we started getting into those conversations that dove really deep into the weeds, acknowledge thoughtfully and authentically that was the continued work moving forward, that this project goes to 2030. It doesn't stop just because we're done our part. So we had to really think about that. And so instead of having final recommendations or where here's the results, or have that quantitative and data collection or whatever that we're so used to doing in academics, we had to thoughtfully say, this is the work that we're at in this journey. This is where our lives have connected in this journey, and our work will connect as well. So we came up with this moving forward. And if you think about collaboration, that would be right around where the work from the previous forum started and continued into this project and this time. And then at the very end of the steps, that's where we're moving onward and asking the next group that will begin the journey of and continue the journey actually of SDG 4 quality education will continue to move. So keeping in mind that leave no one behind is super important, and making that the foundation, one of the foundations of the work moving forward, as well as prioritizing Indigenous knowledge and leadership. We worked together to identify, if you remember the very first slide, that word cloud of all the things that were happening, and realized so much was happening. So what we did is we dove deeper and we talked about and we compared, okay, so how are marginalized groups served here? How is it led by Indigenous knowledge and leadership? So what we identified as moving forward as we began to kind of connect those pieces is that collaboration is really important, and to really identify those collaborative pieces. If you have a new project going on, if you have a new course, if you have a new learning opportunity, are you collaborating with those groups that represent leaving no one behind, who we identified at the beginning? Are you prioritizing Indigenous knowledge and leadership? Not just basing what you're writing on a teaching or something that you heard, but really, truly authentic collaboration. Is it experiential? And again, in our COVID times, making sure that we're not just saying, go grab some baking soda and some water and some vinegar and throw them all together and see what happens, or look what happens when I've done that. So having those conversations, accountability. And again, this kind of ties back with the collaboration. So we hope that the people that continue this work really, really identify things and hold people and projects and themselves and ourselves accountable for what we're doing beyond that checkbox. Beyond, do I have all these components? Did I add this to my framework? Did I add this to my curriculum? Again, partnership. equal partnership, not just engagement, not just collaboration, not just consultation, but really, really true partnerships. Continue, you'll see that the work that Faith identified, that localization. So a part of that localization is identifying that the work that we did and the group did was from this moment in time. And we need to, just because we've localized a few of those targets, doesn't mean they're going to be the same 4 years from now. So that continued revisiting and localizing, much like the agreements that came from Anishinaabe or Indigenous leaders a long time ago, those agreements were meant to be revisited at specific cycles. That's why those strings on a wampum belt were left long. It's right. Do we look back? Yes, we do. And is it still working? So making sure that localization is not a one and done thing. And finally, when having these conversations, they get really hard. Talking about regenerative versus sustainability, identifying that it doesn't have to be versus. It can be an open conversation. It doesn't have to be one or the other. We can collect and live and have those relationships and those understandings all in one place. So moving forward, that the recommendations is that these things are a part of the conversation for whichever group or whichever people or whichever area picks up this SDG number 4, quality education, and moves forward. And next slide. We could go on forever, but we have 15 minutes, which I'm sure is totally gone. And so finally, the members of our action team, action group committee, which we were super thankful for and amazed to be working with. And we would like to say Getchie Miigwech, Anya Gwynn, Cam Douglas, Kathy Dueck, Dean Smith, Hannah McFarlane, Kelly King, Patty Thompson, Paula Anderson, Reem Ali, Rhonda Keenan. And I specifically didn't mention where they work, including myself, because remembering that we all come here and we need to start with that Indigenous perspective or Anishinaabe perspective and acknowledge our humanness and our connection to a key prior to where we work. That's just such a small part of it. I'd rather remember going out and having tea or sharing a dance with one of you than meeting at a meeting. So, miigwech.
What a beautiful, excellent presentation from Liz and Faith and the Quality Education Action Team. You've done such good work, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this work continues and in our community. So, miigwech to both the No Poverty Action Team and the Quality Education Team for such thoughtful and inspiring presentations. We're back. I hope you all had a rejuvenating 5 minutes break to do what you need to do for yourself. So up next, we will hear from the Priority Action Team's Clean Water and Sanitation and the Climate Action. And then after those presentations, we'll split off into breakout groups where you can discuss these SDGs more and their connections and some of the initiatives that our community has going on and that kind of thing. So we look forward to that. So first and foremost, I would like to invite the Clean Water and Sanitation Action Team co-chairs, Elder Dorothy Taylor from Curve Lake and Meredith Carter. And yeah, miigwech for all your work, and I will share your presentation on my screen shortly, and then pass the feather to you.
Miigwech. Well, welcome to our presentation. We were, Meredith and myself, were asked to work on this particular SDG 6, and it has everything to do about water. And as you know, water is is considered a resource, and to the Native people, it's actually a living, breathing, spiritual entity, and it's also referred to as the bloodlines of Mother Earth. So that includes the oceans, the lakes, the streams, the ponds, even the water that falls from the sky. Without this water, as you know, you and me, and everything that we know and hold dear does not exist. So this SDG is important to our very life and our lifestyle, because one thing that the elders did say about this is that if we don't start to change in this generation, that water will become so expensive to buy because we cannot access it. It'll be as much as an ounce of gold for an ounce of water. And, you know, gold today is like $1,800 an ounce. Imagine. So our principle, accessible water for all, and it's an essential part of the world in what we want to live in. Essential part of the world we want to live in. Next slide, please. That's. I guess we could go through this one. Go to the next one, please. Meredith.
Excellent. If we can actually just jump back one, I'm not sure if that's possible. I thought it was important to just start out with a bit of a description, just to make sure everyone understands the clean water and sanitation idea. So what we're talking about here is clean water, both for drinking water, for the environment, and all of the creatures, the flora, the fauna that depend on it, but also for washing and health. Particularly right now, where we all wash our hands many times a day, and we know that that's one of the best ways to prevent many diseases, but coronavirus is obviously first and foremost in our minds. Making sure everyone has access to that is just so critical. So when we look at the goal here, ensuring access to safe water and sources of sanitation, that just becomes critical. Also looking at the idea of that sustainable water management. So that contributes to our own health, the health of the environment, but also our economy. And we're so blessed in this area to have an abundance of water that it makes it even more important for us to protect that, both for our own health and the environment. And we know how interconnected those are. I also, before we get too far into this, I just wanted to express my gratitude for the opportunity to be part of this, and to thank Elder Dorothy Taylor, who I've had the privilege of co-chairing this with. And Dorothy has been so generous with her gifts and her teachings. So Miigwech. We'll express our gratitude to all of the other team members and recognize them individually at the end.
This is the summary statement that we came up as a group. Like when we did together, I guess you all worked, each of the groups worked with a Miro board, which is an electronic whiteboard, and you put stickies on it. We've seen a little bit of that in the last presentation, but we focused on a couple of areas that we came up with as a group. And the first on that list, as you see, is like, you know, this is what I started to say at the beginning, is that we honor the sacredness and spirit of Nebe. Nebe means water in Ojibwe. Gitchatoa Nebe is sacred water. So, you know, we want to dedicate and protect space for Indigenous knowledge and water management. So, you know, it's so important that we have Indigenous perspective when with those people who are in leadership positions and make decisions on behalf of the people for water, that the Indigenous perspective is included in that, because it's unique and it's encompassing and it's life-giving. Also to you know, emphasize the interconnectedness between water and health as a matter of equity. So like one of the main teachings as well when it comes to water, that each and every one of us is related as an Nindandaganuk, as a family member. How are we related? We are all related through the power and the gift of water. Even our very veins has the water, sacredness of water. We call it miskuwapo, which is the red water in our veins, and it's sacred water. So when we're talking about health as a matter of equity, in the Great Spirit's eyes, no one is above or below anyone. So we must work together to have equal access to water. And finally, there's the last two. Water management is shared responsibility. There's so many different levels of governments and legislation that works with that makes decisions on behalf of water. Municipal. We have the provincial and the federal. They all have responsibilities. So, but that Indigenous voice is very important to have in those levels. Watershed approach recognizes interconnectedness, that everyone lives downstream. Is that not the case? Whatever we do, whatever our action is that affects the water, there's a community, an individual, and animals, fish, insects, birds are going to be affected by how we conduct ourselves upstream. So, miigwech, next slide.
During our discussions with our action team, I think we can echo the sentiments of some of the other groups that we would have loved to have more time, and we would have had excellent discussions for another 10 meetings. So we weren't able to localize all of the UN targets for SDG 6, but what we did do is we talked about the ones that we felt were particularly relevant locally. So certainly 6.1, achieving that universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water, that was really important. We heard Chief Wheatung talk this morning about some of the challenges of our local First Nations, and I think we're all aware that Canada isn't meeting some of the targets that were established for March 2021. So this was really important. 6.3, again, looking at improving water quality by reducing pollution, minimizing releases of chemicals and things like that. Again, very important locally. Again, we have a lot of water, making sure that we're using that wisely and protecting that resource. We're fortunate that there's lots of research going on locally related to some of these issues, and upgrades to some water and wastewater technologies, but certainly a long way to go.
6.4. It's a big one. It's all these goals and targets happen to be 2030. So that's not a long ways away. It's like 9 years. Can we achieve that? But substantially increase water use efficiency across all sectors. Increase water use efficiency. So in each and every home, sometimes. All the time, because we live in Canada and we have the greatest concentration of fresh water in the world, i.e. the Great Lakes, and we just have to turn on our taps and bam, we have it. We're super lucky and privileged as a country to have that access to water. That's what access to water, not always healthy and clean as is the case here in Curve Lake, but so what we have to, the only way we have to have more of a goals to increase efficiency. So here's a statistics that I always say when I do my presentations on water. There's only 3% of all the water that exists in the whole world is fresh water. Out of that 3%, 1% of it is frozen. 2% of it's frozen in the poles. The rest of it is 0.5% is on the surface, and the rest of it's underground, which we can't see. So we have the waters, the lakes, and rivers that we see, 0.5% water in the whole world. So we have to really be efficient with it and not take it for granted. Next slide, please.
As we continued looking at the UN targets, 6.5 was also important, and we heard a little bit about this earlier today about the importance of integrated water resource management. And a great example of that is locally, all of the uses that we have for water. We use it for drinking water, recreation, navigation, hydrogeneration, habitat. So there's so many interests there that have to encourage cooperation. So we felt that was certainly locally relevant. 6.6, protecting and restoring our aquatic ecosystems. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat as we do this presentation, and I did see a reference to invasive species. So certainly making sure that we're protecting and preserving the quality of the water and preventing invasive species and all of those things is just so important. Finally, we looked at 6B, supporting and strengthening participation of local communities. And so, of course, this involves many voices, Indigenous communities, water users, so many people, and looking at that shared responsibility. But to me, this one really speaks to the importance of the local communications, cooperation, and collaboration. Again, as Dorothy mentioned earlier, everyone lives downstream, so we're all impacted.
Next slide, please. Again, this is the theme and the binding and the inclusive theme that's going through all the work that's been done for this forum is who gets left behind. So again, we had in our meetings, we had the mural board and we put up there, you know, who gets left behind. And then we're focusing on these four. Water itself and its agency and the spirit, its status as a living being, kind is really recognized in non-Indigenous spaces. You know, so I'd say like maybe in the last, like actually through the work, in my opinion, of the grandmother Josephine Mandamin, who walked in prayer and ceremony around every shoreline of each Great Lake, starting in, I believe it was 2004. And anyways, so since that time, there has been an increased awareness of how water to the Indigenous people is a spiritual living entity, and gratitude and care and love towards that water is essential. And that's part of our teachings. We want to share it with everyone. People without housing and reliable access to washrooms and clean water, you know, during this COVID time, sometimes we overlook the fact that those people who are homeless on the streets of Peterborough don't have access to water or you know, access to washrooms because of COVID. So, and like a lot of the businesses are closed, so we have to really be careful about that and be aware of that and focus on that. Hiawatha, we're talking about downstream, is the first community of also Hastings is downstream from Peterborough, and whatever happens upstream, discharge, chemicals, flooding, whatever, it ends up in Hiawatha, and they are critically affected by the activity of and that has Peterborough, so that has to be brought to the attention. And you know, and then it says in there, like we also have focused that pharmaceuticals, the water treatments do not have the capacity or the ability to stream out the, you know, pharmaceuticals that ends up in our pee, right? So so that's really a problem. So Curve Lake and Hiawatha First Nations, oh, do we still live in this 21st century and this still exists? The fact that we in those two communities don't have access to clean and good water for drinking, showering, and whatever. Has anybody ever lived on this presentation today lived with a boil water advisory? Having to buy water? It's not easy. So that's something that gets left behind. We have to work on. Miigwech. Next slide, please. Is that me me, Meredith?
Yes, please, Dorothy.
Okay, all right. Action team discussion themes. Action team discussion themes, that rhymes. Establish and deepen and repair partnerships between local Indigenous and non-Indigenous institutions regarding water management and governance. As you know, we have the Tonabee River goes past into Little Lake. We have Jackson Creek, you know, so that goes right through downtown. So, I mean, we really have to work together as a whole community, government, institutions, and us little people that have to live by what is decided. So we really have to repair, deepen, and establish more partnerships. Increase access to cross-cultural water education, very important. In our discussion about education, it has to start right in the schools at the primary level, secondary, post-secondary. You know, that education about Indigenous perspective on water, as well as science, biology, etc. Support community-driven water protection and or restoration efforts. Water protection. I don't have to say more about that, but we all know. Strengthen and support local policies. Strengthen and support local policies and best practices to protect water. So we know that there is a lot of effort and work being done in terms of laws and policies and actual action, but it's just not enough if we still have communities that have to be on boil water advisories, that we have beaches shut down because E. coli, levels are increased, etc. And it was a few years back, we're talking 5 years, where all the fish were dying in the Kawarthas, the carps. Like, what caused that? So, like, this is how important that is. Those establish and deepen and repair partnerships, and strengthen and support local policies and best practices to protect water. Next one, please. Well, what we presented prior, we picked, there was so much, actually, there's good news, there's hope, there's a lot of things going on in this beautiful city and county that's working towards, all those case study and, those services that need to be, these are the case studies that we're going to present. There's 4 of them that we said that best are doing that work, establishing and deepening and educating water protection, etc. So, Sacred Water Circle. I'm one of the founding members of the Sacred Water Circle, and the vision of the Sacred Water Circle is, we're a group of volunteers, and we're from different areas of expertise, volunteers, multi-faith. So it's just not Indigenous, and we always have the spirit of Sacred Water in all the work that we do. So it's inspired by traditional Indigenous teaching, inspired and leading with hope and spiritual courage. So we have the spiritual aspect in all the work that we do. Sacred Water sees a restored relationship between the human communities and water. And, we say human communities and water because it's us and our activities. We have forgotten our role and place in this creation. And we have to start reminding and waking up to the fact that water is sacred, water is alive, water has a memory, and it must be treated with highest regard and respect in all our development, in all our actions. And so that's what we do. We're spiritually based dialogue, and we work with all levels of government, particularly Peterborough, and the county has been very receptive to some of the work that we're doing. Miigwech. Next slide. Oh, there's a few pictures coming up. This was in 2010 or 2011 when we had a really small circle of people in the area. This was at Trent University. Next one. Picture. One of the things we do as well, this is at Little Lake. We did the shoreline cleanup. That was a few years ago, and we're going to be doing it again this spring, safely under COVID restrictions. Next picture. And this is just a group picture of some of the majority of our members. You see how it's a Native, non-Native, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and we're all experts in various areas. And so that's a nice picture. You got you.
Thank you, Dorothy. That's such a wonderful example, and it really does showcase all of those important themes that we talked about in our discussions. The next case study that we thought was important to highlight is the City of Peterborough Watershed Plan, Our Watershed, Our Blueprint. And this is a recent initiative that is really looking at that collaborative, collective approach to watershed planning, really recognizes the interconnectedness of the water systems and the impacts on the Peterborough community, but also the neighboring municipalities and Indigenous communities. One of the important facets of this project is that it's science-based, but it also had a large public input component. Again, something else that we thought was really important, making sure that there's lots of opportunities for voices to be heard. Again, recognizing that collaborative effort to protect and enhance our water resources in that first bullet. And identifying areas to be protected, enhanced, and rehabilitated is also a component of this plan. So looking forward, so that's really important as well. Looking at creating and revising policies for the protection and enhancement of our water resources. So again, a great example of some leadership locally to help protect our water resources. And then we've got a couple of photos afterwards. Again, the focus of our watershed, our blueprint, is looking at the watershed, not specifically the Otonabee River, but a lot of the tributaries. So some of these photos will look familiar to some of you. They're the local water courses to help remind you of the beauty and the importance of what this watershed plan is looking to protect. We can go to the next one. Another local creek. And here's a shot of some of the public input. So a wide range of representation, including members from our local First Nations communities.
Case study number 3, the Water Walkers. It's a own group onto its own, separate from Sacred Water Circle, but there's many of us that belong to this, the Water Walkers and the Sacred Water Circle. And Elder Shirley Williams would say, you know, we are the talkers and the Water Walkers are the doers. So we've been walking for water since for 12 years anyways. And how it was started originally by Elder Shirley Williams, and also her niece, Liz Oswamick, and we were inspired by the work of grandmother Josephine Van Damme. But how this works is a lake is identified that we'll walk the water, and then in prayer and in ceremony. And the first lake that was chosen was Rice Lake, again because we're downstream from Peterborough. And didn't we have that big flood one year? So that was like devastating to the community. So Rice Lake was severely affected. So we walked the whole perimeter of Rice Lake, and it was very difficult. It takes, like it's not a walkathon, so you walk. You don't take you don't ride a bike. You don't we walk, and it's led by go into the pictures and you'll see what it's led by. The next slide, please. We has a picture of the water walk. So you have Elder Shirley Williams there. The woman beside her is the chief of Skugog, and see how we have a person there holding a staff. So the pail of water is in copper from the lake we're walking, and we're protected by the men holding the staff. And at some points, there has been up to like 300 people from the community walking all at once. It's amazing. So this is a way of awakening and maintaining the spirit of the water and bringing awareness to how important water is to all life and all our relations. Next slide. This is a group picture, and you see grandmother in there, and you see Liz Oswamick and Elder Shirley Williams, and there's me, and I'm in a wheelchair. I have the hat on. So that's when we did. I think we did the Otonabee River at that time. Yeah, Miigwech, go ahead.
Thank you. Our last case study is the Peterborough Children's Water Festival. And we thought this was just such a wonderful example of increasing awareness of water, experiential education, cross-cultural water education opportunities. So for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's an education program for children from grades 2 to 5. It's offered annually. It wasn't offered last year due to COVID, but it will be offered virtually this year, and it'll be the 19th annual. So that's really exciting. And it's a water festival. It's a celebration of all things related to water. It engages a huge number of volunteers from community members, high school students, and it involves a series of activity stations hosted by various agencies and organizations, and the students get to travel between all of these stations and participate in games and activities and learn more about water. It's hosted at the Riverview Park and Zoo. So it's right on the banks of the Otonabee River, which is also lovely and involves many, many partners. So I have some great photos to share of this as well. And this is a great activity. Again, experiential education. You can tell from the smiles on the faces that they're learning and having a wonderful time. They're learning about that idea of everyone lives downstream and cumulative impacts on water quality. So you've got kids wearing Velcro vests, picking up different colored pieces of felt that represent different contaminants that they might encounter as they roll through the watershed. And then they stand up at the end, take a look at what they've collected and talk about impacts of our everyday activities on water quality. So a great example. This is another station where students are learning about water quality and biology and the aquatic creatures that live in the Otonabee River and our local water courses and what they can tell us about water quality. So again, a great experiential opportunity there to learn more about water. And this is a wonderful activity center. This is Dance Your Own Wild Rice, and this is hosted by James Wheatung. So a great example of some of the cross-cultural water education opportunities, because participants in this station, they learn about the importance of clean water for the growth of wild rice and the history and present day status of wild rice. So a great learning opportunity and certainly making many connections there. There are a number of Indigenous activity stations at the Water Festival. There's awareness and understanding, the water web of life. So this is a really important component of the Water Festival. So we're so pleased that our local First Nations are able to help host these.
Before we thank Action members, say Chimigwaj to all the members that participated in this SDG 6. I think I forgot to say about the water walk is that it's held Mother's Day weekend. And it's Mother's Day because it's women who, in our teachings, women, not just Indigenous women, all women are responsible for water because of our ability of creation, carrying the water of life for our babies to be born. So that's important to say. We like to thank our Action members. I like to do a big chimigwach to my co-chair, Meredith. You are awesome. You did a super job, and thank you for your guidance. And also, these are some of the people that we have. We're on a group. You can read them there. And you want to say anything more?
I want to say miigwech again to you, Dorothy, and to all of our Action team members. They put in a lot of time and energy, and it was I learned so much. So thank you. We also had contributions from some other folks who weren't able to participate in all of the meetings, but we certainly wanted to recognize the contributions from Peterborough Public Health, who obviously was very busy with all things related to COVID, but still managed to find some time for us. Peterborough Utilities, the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. So miigwech, and thank you to all of those folks as well.
Yeah, miigwech.
Miigwech, Elder Dorothy and Meredith. That was such a great presentation and so informative and really inspirational to how important water is to all life. So without further ado, I'm going to invite the Climate Action Team co-chairs, Anna Courier and Dana Jordan, for their presentation. So I will go ahead and share your screen in a moment and invite you to take the floor.
Thanks so much, Shaylin. I'm really excited to be here. I feel that it's such a gift to hear from you and learn from your presentations and really see the fruit of all of this hard work that I know all the teams have been putting together, as well as just to see such an outstanding participation from all of you here at the event today, the forum.
Thanks, Dana. That's a really lovely way to start us off. Yeah, welcome to the Climate Action SDG 13 presentation, and thanks to everybody for sitting tight. The last 3 presentations are a tough act to follow. My name is Anna Courier. Yeah. My name is Anna Courier, and I'm a settler who has called Nogojiwanong Peterborough home for the last 10 years. And I grew up in Toronto, and I'm very pleased to be co-chair of the Climate Action Team with Dana Jordan. And a huge thanks to the team that contributed so many important wisdoms and ways forward. We had city and county representatives, not-for-profit representatives, grassroots advocates and educators. Their names aren't on a slide, but they are Alison Clark, Al Slavin, Cheryl Lyon, Emily Amon, James Byrne, Malika Collette, Natalie Stevenson, Pat Learmonth, Carlotta James, Aaron Hayward, and Stephen Hill. All right, next slide, and I'll hand it over to you, Dana.
That's wonderful. I really appreciate you listing out the team members because their contributions are just so valuable. And yeah, so a little bit more about me and how I found myself involved and inspired by this committee, as well as my co-chair, Anna, is that in 2019, I became a part of the YLS class led by Cam Douglas. And that's where my youth leadership experience just started to flourish and grow from there. I became the youth member on Peterborough's Environmental Advisory Committee, also known as PEAK, and later the co-chair on SDG Climate Action Team. So those experiences really have driven my passion for environmentalism, so much so that next year I'll be looking to a career to follow that way of life and to hopefully be an environmental lawyer. So just down there's a picture of some of my friends and I when we hosted a youth rally across from City Hall about climate action. And it was a really great day. And next slide, please.
Thanks. So I'd also just like to start things off by sharing a framework that personally has given me a lot of hope when it comes to climate change. And that is looking at something like flooding as a messenger of climate change and stormwater as a resource, as opposed to thinking about these things as a nuisance or something to control. Now, I know that's not so easy to remember when there's 6 feet of water in your basement, but valuable nevertheless. But this requires not separating ourselves from nature and natural events, however scary they may be, but instead looking closer at what we can learn from them. This approach obviously isn't anything new. Many Indigenous relations to natural systems and events are very similar. The more we dedicate time to listen to, connect with, rethink, and reframe, the more we open ourselves up to seeing wisdoms and possibilities we otherwise may have ignored. Ultimately, in the context of climate change, we want to emphasize regeneration as an alternative to sustainability, and that's been mentioned through the other presentations as well, a common theme. And that is not just holding steady in a business as usual environment, but restoring ecosystems, infusing nature into our lives, and reconstructing our definitions of growth and progress. Next slide, please. I'll just
I very much agree.
Great. I'm just going to briefly introduce SDG 13 and mention that, so based on the 2019 SDG forum that some of you may have been at, to advance SDG 13, the Peterborough Nogojiwanong community identified that the need to, 1, amplify diverse voices, 2, strengthen data collection, and 3, build on local success. So those priorities have been guiding principles through the work we've done with this team. I'll let Dana expand on that.
Sure. To take a deeper dive into the background of this goal, you really have to examine why it's so urgent to take this action to combat climate change, especially in such a limited, finite time frame, because we know action has to happen now. So a way to sort of break that down or to streamline it is to look at the actual goals that we want to achieve. So post-pandemic green recovery is what we want to plan and execute in a reasonable but effective amount of time. And the long-term systematic shifts that will result from that will actually help to create a greener economy, which would be circular and equitable. And we also want to change the trajectory of atmospheric CO2 levels. So that could be through methods of carbon sequestration, reducing the amount of atmospheric CO2 released by greenhouse emissions, such as polluting and idling. And also global government and citizen collaborative efforts will definitely help bridge the gap between climate action and climate inequality through all of our relations working together on climate action. Thanks. Next one.
Thanks. And just to sort of hone it in on more of a local level, we do have ambitious emission reduction targets, which do require urgent and collective action. On a national level, Canada's plan is to reduce its GHG emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Now, locally, the city and county townships and First Nations all have climate change action plans with their own GHG emission reduction targets that are tailored to their unique communities. But all in all, it's important that we're focusing on strengthening community and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation and adaptation, because there is varying capacities across these jurisdictions. As well, I want to reiterate the importance of infusing nature into our lives and the focus on regeneration. Next slide. Okay, so when it comes to climate change, who gets left behind? This is an important quote just to start things off. The burden of climate change falls disproportionately on those that have historically contributed the least to the problem and have the least resources. So a great example is the youth of today, people like Dana Jordan and Malika Collette, who are doing so much work to so we can all have a better future. Some neglected, so when we're talking about affected and neglected communities in the context of climate change, there is a lot to be learned from their resilience, which must be central in planning for a more regenerative future. Who gets left behind include communities and ecosystems in the north, the coasts, boreal forest, and traditional land-based livelihoods all are being affected. As well, people living in poverty, Black, Indigenous people, people of color, aging, health compromised groups, all are groups subject to oppressions and whose needs are often neglected. And people as well who are houseless and housing insecure are more vulnerable to extreme weather. As well, the agricultural community in an unpredictable climate. And there's an opportunity here to tailor extreme weather and emergency response strategies to the needs and strengths of specific communities. As well, there are capacity limitations of townships and First Nations in the county and an inconsistency in resourcing to implement climate change action plans locally. But there are also lots of opportunities for collaboration and impressive action on the county level regarding community action, especially as of late, that we'll highlight later. As well, it was mentioned in the climate action team that we want to try to not let jurisdictional boundaries be a limitation for collaboration. For example, Lindsay, as our neighbor, are there ways that we could work closely together? And lastly, looking at the impacts to our non-human beings and generally all of our relations. Next slide.
So some of our sorry, is this one?
No, go for it.
Okay, some of the highest priority targets that we examined and determined would be 13.A, to implement the commitment undertaken by local communities and to secure resources. I think my screen just zoomed in way in. Sorry. To address the needs of urban and rural communities. So some opportunities would be recognizing the local action for our grandchildren. And sorry, what's the SP one?
Sustainable Peterborough.
Okay, right. And green economic recovery. And the challenges would be more funding for agricultural industry, new governments for every 4 years, because it's so hard to get a consistent cycle working towards climate rehabilitation when everyone's just focusing on getting elected for the next term, and implementation capacity limitation. Did you want to expand on this?
No, that's great.
Sure. Would you like to read the second one?
No, you can go for it. I'll do the next slide.
Okay, sure. So some promotional mechanisms for raising capacity for effective climate change related planning and management in local run communities, as well as in least developed countries and small island developing states, including focusing on women, youth, and local marginalized communities. This is also very critical to leaving nobody behind. And opportunities would be to make connections between our communities and vulnerable states. So kin networks, supply chains, anybody outside of city bounds or living in a more remote community. Challenges would be acknowledging the difference in urban and rural targets and indicators. Thanks, next one.
Great, thank you. All right, so the last two targets that we worked on localizing are 3.1, strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters. So some opportunities with this are utilizing climate data projections to understand what we can expect in our future, and undertaking strength and vulnerability assessments, which consider all living beings, as well as hard and soft infrastructure. And applying a systems thinking approach, so remembering that we are all downstream, and keeping a pulse on innovative technologies. But of course, some challenges with that are funding, that there are varying levels of capacity and resourcing, and as well, climate change does impact people very differently. And 13.2, integrate climate change measures into local policies, strategies, and planning, and align them with national policies, strategies, and planning. Some opportunities there are improving scientific rigor and standardizing data collection on GHG emissions to understand where we're at and where we need to go, and ensure that there is political will for operationalizing climate change action. And of course, some challenges are focusing on local action and implementation, and looking at how our local actions may have implications abroad. Next slide.
Thanks, Anna, that was great. So some future initiatives here in Peterborough, Kawarthas, and Nogojiwanong would be the experiential and nature-based programming that we're so lucky to have. For example, YLS education. We just wish there were more YLSs out there. And Camp Kawartha. My nephew is personally really enjoying this, and I know when I was his age, I did. Tracks youth program with a focus on initiatives and Indigenous-based knowledge. And public education, one that really stands out is for our grandchildren, and Al Slavin plays a very integral role in that. Sorry, I just have somebody trying to call. Youth focus would be Peterborough Youth Empowerment, and our very own Malaika Collette is a prominent leader on that team. Sorry, the subtitles are blocking what I'm trying to read. Future Majority is also very prominent. So here I just have some pictures. I think the top one is the Peterborough Pollinators Garden. And Peterborough pollinators are just so tirelessly working to promote more living and biodiverse areas in our city. And so I have the YLS logo as well, and some children building forts at Camp Kawartha. Next, please.
Okay, I'm not sure how our time is, but I think we're over, so I'm going to zip through this. We found it really difficult to really narrow down some future initiatives because luckily there are so many. So we thought we'd highlight multiple. All right, so in terms of I'm sorry, Dana, are you going to continue the organization? Sorry about that.
Oh, sorry, no worries. Yeah, so as Anna was saying, food justice and agriculture are focuses in terms of these organizations, and some really standout ones are Food Not Bombs, and they work on food waste reduction and redistribution. Also Nourish Peterborough, as well as Farms at Work. They all play very integral roles here in Peterborough. Flood and drought resiliency brings to light Deep Pave Paradise and all of their efforts locally, as well as Voices for Minoman and the Wild Rice. Same thing, I can't read that. Green Economy, the Green Economy Hub. Thanks. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks. All right, so when it comes to government initiatives, in terms of waste management, where you can all look forward to Peterborough's source separated organics grow program, so a way that we can sustainably divert our organic waste and reduce methane-based GHG emissions. Climate action investments. So the city's climate action plan reserve fund, it's evidence that the city is taking initiative to ensure resourcing for climate change action. As well, County and GreenUP's partnership for community climate action initiatives. They're partnering to advance and provide resourcing for community climate action in the townships and First Nations through a series of programs. In terms of green infrastructure, funding is allocated for Curve Lake First Nations catch basin and stormwater improvements, very important and due time asset management upgrades. In terms of transportation, we have the Link Rural Bus Service, which will provide rural public transportation and reduce reliance on passenger vehicles and the emissions that they emit. As well, we're seeing expansion of electric vehicle and active transportation infrastructure between and across city and county. Next slide. All right, and then in terms of legislation, energy conservation and homeowner support, Builders for Climate Action between Douro Dummer and the Endeavour Centre, a partnership project focused on embodied carbon of buildings, something that Vancouver has actually noticed and is following suit, which is exciting to have that kind of reach. As well, the city's anticipated home energy retrofit incentive program. This will help homeowners save on their energy bills, as well as reduce residential GHG emissions, which is a very high emitting community sector. Resiliency and adaptation. The city's community climate change resiliency and adaptation actions will focus on protecting us from climate impacts and hopefully ensuring that no one is left behind in this process. And just generally in terms of plans and policies, the new federal climate action plan is a strong focus on Indigenous partnerships. I believe Trish O'Connor had shared that paper in the chat. And we're seeing that through projects like the SDG project and those mentioned, the initiatives mentioned before, that there is more of a focus on the interconnection and continuity among climate change plans and policies across city and county. So you can go to the last slide, Shay. So thanks, Miigwech, to everybody for joining us. Sorry we went over time. And just to sort of tie things all together, I will leave you with the question to reflect on. What does a regenerative future mean to you? Thanks.
Yes, again, thanks. And we appreciate everyone sitting tight and being such good listeners.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Dana.
Thanks, Anna.
Yes, Miigwech, thank you so much to Anna and Dana and the whole climate action team for all the work that you've done in highlighting the most important parts that came out of our action team meetings. And I look forward to seeing how this work continues. Each of the action teams that you heard will be developing their final reports that will summarize their work over this past half of a year. Also our Indigenous project consultant, Gary Pritchard Jr., is working to create an Indigenous engagement programming report. Also, we know that these will be great resources for our community, and we're really excited to share them with you. Also, beyond this project, I'm gonna share my screen. So beyond this project, we are confident that the work and the reports emerging from our time together will advance our community's progress on the SDGs. We have been working with Sustainable Peterborough, the Community Foundation of Greater Peterborough, the Peterborough Kawartha's Regional Center for Expertise on Sustainable Development, and others to build connections to this project and to identify opportunities to ensure the SDGs remain a focus in the work we've done. Already, we've had the opportunity to highlight this project at the UN Regional Centers of Expertise for Education on Sustainable Development Americas Conference, and to share our goals with the RCEs across the continent. So this work is shared really broadly. As we release our final reports, we will continue these important conversations. As part of post-forum reporting, we will also provide information about emerging local projects or collaboratives that are working to advance these priorities in Peterborough, Nogojiwanong. We look forward to supporting the continuation of this work to make communities more sustainable and regenerative, to help heal our collective relationships with the land, waters, creatures, people, and all our relations that we share this life with. Chimigwech, everyone, for being a part of this process. I now want to invite Julie Cosgrove, the Executive Director at KWIC, to say a few final words before we invite Elder Phyllis Williams to close the community forum in a good way. So Chimigwech, Julie, and Elder Phyllis, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Shay. I'd just like to reiterate how very grateful we are for the many voices and perspectives that have informed this project, including those of you who are here with us today, and for the leadership of the coordinating committee and the action team chairs that you've heard from today, Elder Phyllis Williams, Ann Taylor, and Gary Pritchard Jr., for Margaret Zhou's quiet diligence researching and supporting this work, and Shirley Williams' gift of presence. When we received news of the funding last March, just as the COVID restrictions were unfolding, there was a moment of small panic, trying to imagine how a project conceptualized in relationship in place could unfold in a virtual world and in a good way. But as you've seen, it did, and with a lot of extra hard work behind the scenes and in front, carried by our project coordinators, Shaylin, Wabagijik, and Haley Goodchild. So on behalf of myself and KWIC and our very cherished partner, Brianna Solomon at GreenUP, and I think from all of us who have had the pleasure of working with you both these past several months, a really big thank you. You are truly awesome, Shay and Haley, and we are very grateful and inspired by your passion for your work, your dedicated, unwavering support for the teams that you supported, the magic you brought in discovering and learning new tools and technologies that created interactive and accessible spaces for us to be together, for your imagination, your humor, and your kindness. Chimigwech, we're very grateful. And I'd like to pass the Zoom over to Elder Phyllis Williams to close us in a beautiful, beautiful way. Thank you to everyone. Is Phyllis still with us?
I was on mute.
I can't see you.
So I'll start over. Chimigwech, Julie. First, I want to wish Chimigwech to Shaylin Wabagijik, who navigated us through this forum as MC, and for all the good work she'd done throughout, certainly keeping us on track. To Haley Goodchild, Equally to her, she was an asset to move our agendas along, valuing her many contribution in our work sessions and this forum. Also to Julie for her inspiration and pledge to do this work with us. To my cherished friends, Ann Taylor and Gary Pritchard Jr., who assisted to move our responsibilities to the forefront, in so much that the work we completed caused the hard conversations to the other SDG groups. I extend many thanks to all who participated over the 2 days. We had a rich experience. Remember what we learned to apply ourselves whenever and wherever we can. So let's close our day in a good way. Creator, miigwech for the beauty and the care of our